All right. Hello and welcome everyone to the Imagine Belonging at Work podcast. We are streaming to you live through our private Facebook community called Belonging at Work. So if you're joining us there, welcome. I'm super excited to have a conversation about how to build solidarity within your own LGBTQ plus ERG, employee resource group, and thrilled to have award-winning filmmaker and Emmy nominated filmmaker, Fiona Dawson, with us, who I will introduce in just a bit. Want to share a little bit of context about why we're having this conversation today. So a little bit of background. We were just talking about the importance of data before we got going. So if you know of the Williams Institute, they're based out of UCLA's law school. They do a lot of demographic studies around LGBTQ plus communities. And in their work, they found that over 8 million employees in the United States are LGBTQ plus. And some really harsh statistics related to this big figure is that nearly half of these employees have endured some form of mistreatment, some unfair treatment on the job at some point in their careers, with 57% of LGBTQ plus folks experiencing unfair treatment motivated by religious bias, right? And these experiences of discrimination are amplified for those of us who are BIPOC and transgender and folks living at those intersections. So given some of these harsh realities, it's really no surprise that about half of LGBTQ plus employees are not out to their current supervisor, and 26% are not out to anyone on the job. And if you're familiar with my work, you know I talk a lot about covering the things that are most precious to who we are. It compromises our sense of safety in any environment, truly, and especially in the workplace. And it erodes our interpersonal trust with each other at work and beyond. And complicating some of these barriers is this renewed focus, this anti-LGBTQ plus legislative campaign taking place in the United States that really is attempting to erode the limited rights that we've already secured over these past couple of decades. And this campaign is most acutely targeting transgender and gender expansive people. So I know many of you all are here today because you're committed to advancing your diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments at work, and you want to do more to show up for LGBTQ plus folks during these really chilling times. And so I couldn't think of a better person to talk about thinking about our community dynamics broadly and really trying to engage in that concept of targeted universalism, really trying to get that universal goal of the fact that we want to improve experiences for LGBTQ plus people. And we're not going to reach that unless we really start to center our approaches around those in our communities that are having the hardest time, particularly in these moments that we're living through right now. So all of that to say, super thrilled to introduce you all to Fiona Dawson. And if you're not familiar with who she is, she's awesome. And you're going to know in just a bit about how awesome she is. She is an Emmy nominated and award-winning filmmaker. She is a proud bisexual cisgender immigrant woman from the LGBTQ plus community, and she is the founder and director of Free Lion Productions, where she and her team create content to make diversity, equity, and inclusion programs work. She's received many notable awards, including President Obama's LGBT Artist Champion of Change for her Emmy-nominated short Transgender at War and in Love, and the 2018 South by Southwest Audience Award for her documentary Transmilitary. So together, we're going to be talking about her book, Are Bisexuals Just Greedy? Animated Answers for All People Who Simply Want to Understand the Spectrum of Being LGBTQ+. It is awesome. I highly recommend it. We're going to learn how to engage the silent majority within our LGBTQ+ community, which, hint, if you weren't certain about who that silent majority is, it's bisexual folks. And we're going to recognize why solidarity in our LGBTQ+ ERGs, in our communities more broadly, is really important, especially in this moment that we're in right now. And we're going to unpack what gets in the way. So Fiona, with all of that, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. So we're not going to do much then.
No, not. We're just going to have a little conversation.
No ambitious goals here.
Right. You know, it's just a friendly conversation, and we're talking about things that just, you know, they live in our hearts. And I think that it will be really instructive for a lot of folks who are joining us today. So I want to first congratulate you on publishing your book. I know that that is no easy task. It's huge. And you're about to, your book is about to have its first book anniversary around September 23rd, right? Which is National or International, I guess, Bisexual Visibility Day. And that's where I want to start with you, right? Is just to share with us a little bit more of all the books that you could write about our LGBTQ plus communities and sexual orientation in particular. Why did you write this book? Why did you write this particular book? And what's your primary goal with what it achieves?
Thank you so much for having me here, Rose. This is awesome. Love diving right into this question. I actually did not set out to write this particular book. I originally was going to begin writing my memoir, and you know our dear friend Jen Grace of Publish Your Purpose. I know that you know what it's like to publish a book too. And so it was late 2019, which we can all relate to. And I decided, okay, it's time to write my book. So I joined one of Jen's classes in February of 2020 and started the writing process of my memoir that I thought at the time. However, I was also filmmaking, and I was making a proof of concept TV episode for my show that I am looking to get out there. And within that TV episode, which centers on a story around a trans woman from Honduras, I had created a 2-minute animation explaining the difference between the words cisgender and transgender. Because with all of my work advocating for trans service members, I often got asked the question, first of all, it's like, what does it mean to be trans? But then increasingly, people were actually asking me, what does cisgender mean more, more often? And I thought, well, the majority of people are cis. We should really understand what the difference is. And when I was creating this story for the TV show, I didn't want people to get stuck on language and labels and look at Kate as a trans woman and then trying to understand what cis was. And so I have this record scratch when you come out and you have this 2-minute explainer, animated, telling you the difference, and then you go back to the story.
Yeah.
So that was out, and that received, a lot of attention. And I thought, wow, people have got a lot of questions about terms and labels under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella. So I decided to write some more scripts, hoping to turn them into animation. So there am I writing scripts for TV and then writing my memoir. And I got so excited about the scripts, way more excited than my memoir. First of all, I thought I'll put them into the memoir. And then finally, the pandemic hits and everything, falls apart. And I leave Brooklyn and I'm so excited about this. And I thought, I've got more life to live. I'll just put the memoir over here somewhere, and decided that these scripts needed to come out as soon as possible, and turned it into a book. So there we have Are Bisexuals Just Greedy? Animated answers for all people who simply want to understand the spectrum of being LGBTQ+. And so it's a cheeky explainer book. It's 21 chapters, but each chapter is about 2 or 3 pages in length. It takes you about 5 minutes to read each one. And it's just answering very direct questions that people have about our community. And these questions come from LGBTQIA+ people and allies as well. And it's just telling you what something means so that you can move on and relate to someone as a person without getting stuck on their label.
I love
Hopefully
it. I love it. And I just last week, or actually 2 weeks ago, we had our Belonging at Work summer school. And one of the last kind of areas that we focused on was just different learning styles. So the kind of this VARC learning method of like, some of us are visual learners, audio learners, we like to read and write, or we're kinesthetic, we need to move. And what I love about your work is, one, you're off, you're in that kind of filmmaker space, you're creating experiences, you're sharing stories, and I'll go back to that in just a bit. And with this book, you're also engaging maybe a completely different audience that wouldn't necessarily resonate with the visual kind of learning experiences that you offer. And it's just different entry points of getting what people need to be like, oh, you've explained it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. No one ever taught me that before. So it kind of, I love it because it's an invitation in to understand more without guilting or shaming, or how could you not know this? I roll, it's this. So thank you for doing that. And also thank you for putting your memoir off for just a little bit, living life a little bit more. Yeah, you can always go back to that, right? But I think that's the challenge when you get that creative burst and you're like, I'm ready to write. I've kind of been consuming a lot and I'm ready to kind of share what I know. And sometimes it's hard to narrow in of, I know that there's this thing, and you kind of follow the twists and turns and you follow the breadcrumbs, and that book is beautiful. So thank you for Thank you for creating it. So
Thank
now I
you.
want to go back to the power of storytelling and
Mm,
just kind of mention your multimedia production now with Fiona. And that
mm,
whole experience amplifies positive LGBTQ plus stories of kindness and courage. I love that. So
mhm.
my question for you is, how can the power of storytelling help open up more hearts and minds to the experiences of LGBTQ plus people in the workplace? And to what extent can employee resource group programming help with amplifying those stories?
Oh gosh. Okay, such juicy questions. So first of all, I'm going to start with the second question. Excuse me, the second question first.
Sure, sure.
And that is, I like to try and break things down into biteable nuggets that are memorable.
Mhm.
And so the four things, and this is, I'm keep looking at the book because it's actually like in the conclusion where it's steps to allyship. And these steps to allyship, I think, can translate into steps to leadership, steps to team building, like basically steps to everybody getting together and having a good time. And
Mhm.
so the four steps that I have here is number one, know yourself, which is basically self-awareness. Number two is consider others, which is awareness of others. And then three is courageous action, and four is collaboration. And so I really feel whether it's on an individual level or whether it's on a corporate business model level, you always have to start internally and you have to come to understand your own personal identities. And of course, the common analogy that we use in our DEI space is the iceberg analogy, where,
Mhm.
10% is visible or apparent, I've learned to say now, where 10% might be apparent, but there's this whole 90% underneath that is hidden underneath the surface. And we actually have so many different things in common in and outside of our LGBTQIA plus community. And so I think it's like first doing our own internal work as a member of a resource group as to, okay, so I'm part of the queer resource group, but what other identities do I have? And I'll use myself as an example. I'm also a woman living with a disability. I need to add that to my bio. I just realized in that I'm hard of hearing. So I have hearing aids in both ears, just two ears. And so I'm now a member of the disability in community as well. And that's been really mind opening for me because that's a new identity and a new label. So for me, being part of the queer community has been, a couple of decades long. Being a part of this community is a whole new experience, and having the opportunity to see the intersectional levels of that has been so important for me as a person. And then I can understand within DEI and within corporations, allowing those employee resource groups themselves to not sit in silos as well, and to be able to find ways for them to come together is so important. So I would say really leaning into the intersectionality of our human experience is so important. And that leads to the first part of your question about the power of personal storytelling. And so I often list like 5 reasons why stories are so powerful. And I can put these in show notes, or I
Yeah,
can give you a memorable picture stack
please.
to remember. But I think about capturing attention. So first of all, stories capture attention. The second is that they're memorable, and they're way more memorable than facts alone. Like studies show that a personal story is way more memorable than like listing data, which is why I think sometimes I have such a hard time remembering numbers. The third is building rapport. So stories allow people to see themselves in each other where they might not have done otherwise. So building rapport. 4 is building credibility. When you share a personal story, and a true personal story or an anecdote, people cannot deny your experience. And that's a difference between saying, we should have this, but if you're backing it up with a personal story, then you're leading somebody to that conclusion themselves. And then 5th is building a team atmosphere, which I think is what we're looking for, across ERGs and within the workplace as well. So that's one of the reasons why I really, really lean into personal stories. And I can tell you just a quick example of how I've personally seen this in action, where with my work with trans military, where we shared stories of active duty trans service members before the ban on their service was lifted. And we actually received emails and correspondence afterwards from people who had said, I formerly didn't think trans people should be able to serve in the military. After hearing Layla's story and Logan's story and Jen's story and Elle's story, I realized that I was completely wrong. And now I understand there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to serve. And I think that that really helps bring people in. And so for me, my personal thing is I don't want to go out and cancel someone. Like you were saying about the book, I don't want to go beat someone up or attack someone because they don't know something. I don't want to fight hate. I want to promote love. And the way I do that is through sharing people's personal stories.
I love that. I don't want to fight, I want to promote love. And I think that the breakdown that you just offered, one on kind of those allyship tips of knowing yourself, being aware and consider others, courageous actions, collaboration, that's such a gift. So thank you for sharing that. And then, really underscoring the power of storytelling, which is kind of capturing attention, making stories memorable, the building rapport. That's so huge. We're about to enter into our Belonging at Work Summit season. We're launching that in November. And the big theme of this year is moving at the speed of trust. So that idea of building rapport is something we're really going to explore there. And I love that you're talking about that now through the storytelling, which helps build credibility and then that kind of team atmosphere. And I love that, as maybe a framework for those folks who came today or are listening now around really trying to think like, how am I building solidarity within my own ERG? Like, yes, my own credibility is I am a member of, or maybe I have a family member who's LGBTQ plus, like whatever's bringing you into that ERG, there's a credible story that you have. And then it's getting curious enough to kind of learn the stories of other people that are not going to be your own, right? And may come from different angles of our communities, right? Like, and so that's where I want to kind of go next, is this recognizing that at times, and I'm sure you've been in spaces, I certainly have, where they're LGBTQ plus, we're welcoming everyone kind of space. That's that universal goal. And then you show up and there's some discord. There isn't necessarily that kind of harmony that maybe some of us were hoping to feel. And when it comes to LGBT ERGs, this is my own experience. So, I sometimes encounter newly formed groups with an overrepresentation of members who hold dominant identities. So maybe more members are cisgender, men, white, able-bodied, English is their first language, on and on. You gave some great examples of intersectionality. And in my experience, some of these members engage in this kind of very fancy term, intersectionality erasure, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, right? And basically what that means is that these folks might ignore considering the barriers encountered by people who hold two or more marginalized identities that can't be separated from who they are. So you gave a couple of examples just from your own identities, being a bisexual, cisgender, being a bisexual person who's hard of hearing, right? These are two marginalized identities that if you showed up into a space, you want to bring all of that and have people to be curious about who you are, right? Without kind of erasing one aspect of that. Okay, so that's a lot of context for the question that I have, which is, one, I'm wondering if you two encounter this kind of dynamic in ERGs or maybe in community space more broadly. And, I'm just wondering how we center the group's broader goals around the needs of those within the group that are encountering more barriers that maybe not everyone can see. These are invisible barriers that if the group as a whole, if the LGBT ERG as a whole recognized, okay, maybe not all of us experience the fears, worries, or concerns of, using the restroom every day in the workplace. Like, how can we get more curious about some of our members who are having that challenge? That's just an example that as a trans person I'm thinking of, but I'm curious, like, what's coming up for you? Do you see this in your own practice? And if so, what are some ideas to help us orient to, yes, we want all LGBT employees to have an exceptional experience in this organization. And if we don't start targeting our efforts around those who are having the greatest struggle, we're not going to get there, right? So it's kind of curious what pops up for you on that question.
Yeah, I do see it because in addition to doing the independent film work, my team and I at Freeline Productions, we create personal storytelling content using video and animation to help DEI programs be more effective. And so we're doing work within corporations as well. And listening to you introduce the question reminded me to say that, you know, one of the other labels that I have for myself is immigrant.
Yeah.
But my label of immigrant comes with incredible privilege because of the country where I was born and because of the way my accent sounds.
Yes.
So my immigrant status, you know, puts me leaps forward, whereas somebody else with an immigrant status from a different country and a different accent is put in a completely different category. And so I think that that's kind of an illustration of some of the work that we can do within the LGBTQIA plus umbrella community, in being able to like take a step out of ourselves and look at ourselves outside of our queer identities, and realizing and giving people opportunity to realize that there's more to me than just this one label. And how do all of these labels affect how I interact with other people in the world? And so to start off with, in order to build solidarity and community within the LGBTQIA, and I keep saying QIA because I've recently become aware that leaving out I and A is part of our problem.
Yes.
we can come back to that conversation in a bit. But anyway, so again, first of all, I go to the storytelling because oftentimes people who don't identify as one of us put us into a box and a monolith, and they just assume that we all get along and everything's great, and saying everyone's gay in that community is fine. Yeah. And so I've actually had conversations with allies who are surprised when I say, oh, we don't all get along, we don't all agree. And so I think even within our community, we need to give each other space to hear and listen to other people's personal stories as well, so that we're not making assumptions about each other. You know, most trans people are bisexual, closely followed by most trans people are straight. And so, you know, those straight trans people need to be seen and heard too. But then also the people that have had the majority, you know, cis white gay English speaking men, you know, I'm gonna label that, they have other identities too. And I think it kind of relates to one of the problems I see when we're working on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that word diversity is increasingly becoming a trigger word, because the word diversity gives the impression that if you're straight, white, and cis, then you're not part of that community. But actually, straight, white, cis people are diverse too. Every human being, in my mind, we're all spiritual beings having a human experience. And those human experiences are just made up of a mosaic, like meat suits, let's say. And so all these people, we have to see the humanity in everybody. And so in some ways, I would like to have more porous walls between our ERGs, and being able to like call people into our conversation more, because otherwise we're just increasing this divide of a them versus us. And as an out bisexual woman, I feel that there are many people who are seen as straight who actually have way more in common with our experience than we know, because we're not giving space for their experience and their voices to be heard too. So, you know, one day, I think that when we have equity in policy and healthcare and law, it's going to be less about an LGBTQIA plus community versus everybody else. And it's more going to be, hey, human, you have a one or more gender identities, you have one or more sexual orientation identities, you have one or more biological sex identities. Would you like to pick off this, you know, checklist of all these different things that make you up? And I know that's a long way ahead, but I think kind of like land this answer to your question, I would say that we have to have the courage to get to know ourselves better. Really.
Yes, that is it's so interesting that you ended with that, because it goes back to one of the pieces of allyship is that courageous actions. And I heard this described a couple of days ago, and I really like it, of this idea of courage, right? Where, I don't know, maybe the first thing that comes to mind for me is like thinking of a superhero, right? Yet when I feel like I'm in moments of courage, I'm usually like, fear is like right here on my shoulder, and it's like, this is really scary, and I'm doing it anyway, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of, to me, what courage feels like. It doesn't really feel good when I'm in it, yet doing it, the end result, the impact, like knowing the kind of the outcome, it's totally worth it, right? Of like, I'm doing this because I want to get there. And so I think that courage of knowing ourselves can sometimes be scary if we're entertaining, oh, this is an aspect of my identity I've never talked about before. I've never had this internal dialogue about who I am, and I'm learning more about that. So that's really cool. And I liked what you were talking about, of how we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and we're kind of in these meat suits. I think it's like we're all in drag in some ways, right? Like in terms of our identities.
Yes.
So there's that. And maybe that's a stretch for some folks listening, but that's kind of it. And it's getting curious, right? Of that invitation, no matter kind of, and you used apparent, and I really like that. No matter like what might be externally apparent to another person encountering you maybe for the first time, or other times it's like the assumptions of what people kind of take in on that first experience. And that is definitely not the whole story. And what I really love working with leaders is inviting them in, just as you did right now in your response, of really checking in with your diversity story, like what connects you to this work, which leads with the D, which leads with diversity. So I encourage people, like, if you're, and I feel this too, is like this word that is becoming somehow like a bad word in our movement is like the reason why we're doing the work, right? Is because we are different, and we're trying to get curious and engage across those differences. Because when we can really make that mix work, that's where the magic happens on teams or in groups or whatever. And so that's where I want to go with like thinking about solidarity. That's one of the focuses of this conversation. And so when I think about your body of work, Fiona, I think about the promise of engaging with the invisible majority within our rainbow, within the LGBTQIA plus communities, right? So when we say invisible majority, I'm talking about 3/5 of all LGBTQ plus adults in the US who are bisexual. 3/5. That is the movement right there. And this invisible majority endures biphobia from within our rainbow communities and certainly beyond. And you and I know really well, right, that bisexual people are frequently ignored, discriminated against, demonized, or rendered invisible by both straight and lesbian and gay communities. And in the worst scenarios, our sexual orientations are branded as invalid or immoral or irrelevant. And those are harsh realities. So I just like want to kind of like, it's hard to kind of say those out loud, and they're real. And while we can explore them, what I'd rather do is learn more about your perspective about the promise of LGBT solidarity. Like, what could it be, so that we can have a more effective movement at a time when things are really scary, and really inviting in the voice of bisexual folks and maybe centering it, right? Like, what would be different, and what's that promise? Like, what kind of drives you in this work?
I think building solidarity has to start with a foundation of trust. And again, going back to the self-awareness and awareness of others, I think that when you feel confident in yourself and you're not feeling like it's a zero-sum game where somebody else's empowerment is going to take away from mine, but in fact, the room just grows larger. I think that you have less fear of what might happen to you, and you can find a place to build trust. I think increasing by inclusion, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but going back to the storytelling and understanding different people's lived experience of being bi plus is so important. And so that comes from listening twice as much as speaking, and people within our community like having the opportunity to hear and learn each other's stories. As somebody who's very passionate about TV and film, visibility needs to increase within the media as well. And like going back to a lot of the tropes that you were saying, oftentimes characters in TV, if it's a bi character, then they're deceitful, they're untrustworthy, and all of these things kind of relate back into a workplace as well, which shows that, you know, bi plus people are overlooked within the workplace when it comes to promotions and all that kind of stuff because of this unconscious bias and this stigma. or in TV and film, you know, they're just basically killed off at the end. And or they're using their bi identity as a plot twist, or like trying to be manipulative in some ways. And so how we're portrayed in the media affects how we are then treated within the workplace. So I think in addition to the personal storytelling, is weaving into a greater understanding of the difference between gender identity, biological sex, and sexual orientation, and acknowledging within the LGBTQIA plus community, we have a lot to learn ourselves. I first came out as a lesbian in 2004 and later re-identified as bisexual in 2012. And I think one of the reasons why, or I didn't initially think I was bi, was because I was holding internalized biphobia myself from all the things that, you know, we've just listed. And I didn't understand the difference, or excuse me, I did not understand what sexual orientation is. And it's actually like three different things. It's an identity, it's an attraction, and it's a behavior. So, you know, identity, meaning what label feels comfortable for you. Attraction, what are the gender labels of the people you might be potentially attracted to? And then B, behavior is like, how do you act upon that? And all these three different things are true for straight people as well. Like we're going back to the mosaic, we all have like a combination of these things. And so I think that people who've identified as a binary sexual orientation, like gay, lesbian, and or straight, it's through no fault of their own. I'm not casting any blame. They may not have had the opportunity to be able to consider a non-binary sexual orientation identity, which essentially bi plus pan plus is. Like, we're just a non-binary sexual orientation. In the same way you can get a non-binary gender identity, you can get a non-binary sexual orientation. And so I think that when we give other people the opportunity to have a greater consideration of this, I have faith that we will build more empathy and build trust, because it's just like resolving that educational gap that we have, you know, within our own community as well. Yes. And anecdotally, I can tell you, having been a part of this community for 2 decades, there are so many people who use the labels of gay and lesbian, but will confidentially share with me that actually they're kind of bi.
Yes.
But because they're in a relationship with someone of a similar or same gender, and other people see them as gay or lesbian, it's easier for them to do that. And again, I'm not blaming them at all, because, you know, sometimes we've got enough to deal with without having to then fight for our for our sexual orientation label as well. Yes. But you know, 57%, what's interesting when you're saying about the statistics, about 57% of LGBTQ people face discrimination in the workplace. 57% of our community is actually bisexual. It's 56.8%. That's close to 60%. Yes. And that's like across many generations. Today, 1 in 6 Gen Z identifies as bi plus, as bisexual. The future is very queer. And so I think that we have this amazing opportunity to kind of empower our community by taking ourselves out of the buckets and taking everybody out of the bucket, including, you know, people with a binary identity like gay and lesbian. I think I get excited about it, if you can't tell.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. And I feel, you know, one of the pieces that you said around folks within our own communities who will, you know, because they trust you, will share like, hey, I actually am kind of bi plus. It's that, whether it's internal biphobia or external, it's like in those moments, it's the fear of the external, like, well, I might not have access to the same communities, or that might compromise relationships. So it just speaks to how prevalent biphobia really is, both within our communities and outside of it. And that's really my last kind of formal question before we go into our private Q&A, which is this kind of like acts of allyship. That's what I want to focus on. And so recognizing that our work is necessarily to build bridges across our vibrant rainbow communities. I'm curious from your perspective, Fiona, if you believe that we LGBTQIA plus people have something to learn from our straight and cisgender colleagues, at least the ones who engage in everyday acts of allyship, to help us build a greater sense of solidarity within our own communities. So, when you think of those outstanding allies, I used to work at PFLAG, right? So I just think immediately of parents with, queer kids trying to figure it out and like, okay, I love my kid, so I'm going to show up for them. And the ways that they show up, I'm just wondering like how we can learn from straight and cisgender people who are doing that work really, really well, of like, how can we do more of that inside of our communities where we really need it, rather than, challenging, well, you're not really a part of our community because of X, Y, or Z. It's more of kind of like, we need everybody, so let's build each other up. Let's do that asset building. So I'm just kind of curious what shows up for you.
Yeah, over the years, I've experienced a lot of that where our community says, oh yes, we want allies, but then allies are kind of othered. And it's kind of similar to how bi+ people are treated as well, because if I'm seen in a relationship with somebody who's a different gender from me, I'm assumed to be straight, so therefore I'm in an ally bucket and I'm kind of pushed out. And then another later topic of conversation is when you're single for years and years, then where do you lie?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. But I think that there are many ways that all people, including our straight allies, have shown incredible allyship, and very simple things as well. For example, being able to state your pronouns when in your life and experience people would correctly assume your pronouns is one of the best forms of allyship. And because it shows that you understand that other people might not be safe, or other people's gender identity may be non-apparent. And so when you're coming out with your pronouns, that you're giving that space. But that's something that us within the LGBTQIA+ community can do too, where, let's model ourselves after our straight allies, so that we are supporting the people who have less privilege than we do, who might be more of a non-binary identity than we are, whose external experience doesn't necessarily, their external expression doesn't necessarily reflect their internal experience. And I think that that's something that everybody can do, regardless of your sexual orientation or gender identity.
I love that. I think that's where those are my kind of formal questions for you, Fiona. For folks that are tuning in live, or if you're listening to the podcast, this is where we part ways, sadly, and we're going to go into our private question and response session with our Belonging Network community members. And I just, as closing, if we want some closure here, Fiona, I'm curious for you, when you think about the future of work and the promise of it. You shared a little bit about your vision of what kind of LGBTQ+ solidarity can look like in the workplace. I'm just wondering more broadly, in the work that you do with organizations to make their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs work, making them really dynamic. Help us see some of the end goal, right? The end goals of at least your vision of a future culture of work where it's working more for us rather than kind of working for the people that it was designed to work for from the beginning, but leaving so many of us out of the picture. Like, what do you see that can motivate us?
I'm going to say how I think we could get there. And that is going back to courage and having corporations have the courage to let go of their corporate speak. And I know that it's important for corporations, DEI programs to have the corporate mandate. And, we believe this statement and we believe all these people should be included. And yes, those words are important, but I think that we have to be prepared to have alternative messaging that takes that corporate speak out, all the hot buttons that trigger people and turn people off. We need to find a way to be able to share people's personal experience and make the pillars of DEI resonate and important, but without telling people what to do. And for me, that really comes down again to personal storytelling, where we'll create content that will share someone's lived experience of colorism and how having a darker skin tone has affected them in ways that people with lighter skin tones would never even have considered, because we hadn't lived that experience. So we're not to blame for that, but we just weren't aware of that. So rather than telling people you must do this and you must not do that, Instead, hey, meet this person and hear about their experience. And so you're letting people come to their own conclusion without telling them what to do. And I think that there's great intent in corporations coming out and mandating you must do this and you must do that. But I just don't think it's so effective because it creates a resistance. And so you can achieve the end goal of equity, of inclusion, by allowing people to see themselves in each other in a much more organic, independent way.
Yes. So so more of that. If you're in our Belonging Network community, we're gonna explore more right now. For everyone who's tuned in elsewhere, thank you for being here. Thanks for growing our belonging movement, and thank you, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Rhodes. Thank you and thank you everyone for listening. Thank you.